Nestled deep within a dense forest, the Whispering Pines vacation cabins have long been a destination for families seeking solitude. Each cabin stood isolated enough to offer privacy, yet close enough to lend a sense of community if needed. Visitors often remarked that the towering pines seemed to hum in the breeze, as though whispering secrets to one another. The allure of nature, coupled with the promise of peace, made the location irresistible for families looking to escape the chaos of city life. But there was an unspoken rule among locals: never stay too long. The Jefferson family arrived at the cabin late on a Friday evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet. Mark, the father, steered their SUV down the gravel path, the crunch of tires breaking the eerie silence. Beside him, his wife, Rachel, clutched a folded map with directions scribbled in ink. In the back seat, their teenage daughter, Emma, stared at her phone, scrolling through social media with disinterest, while their younger son, Luke, pressed his nose against the window, enchanted by the towering trees. "This place is amazing," Luke exclaimed, his breath fogging the glass. "It's like something out of a storybook." "It's remote, that's for sure," Rachel said, glancing at the shadowy forest. "Perfect for a little peace and quiet." Mark parked the car in front of the cabin, a modest wooden structure with a slanted roof and a porch adorned with rocking chairs. It looked picturesque, almost too perfect, as though plucked from a postcard. The family unloaded their bags, their voices carrying through the still air as they settled in. Inside, the cabin was cozy yet rustic. A stone fireplace dominated the living room, and a collection of vintage photographs hung on the walls, each depicting past visitors posing in front of the same cabin. Emma wrinkled her nose at the lack of Wi-Fi. "Great, no signal. This is going to be so much fun," she muttered sarcastically, earning a reprimanding look from her mother. As the family unpacked, an unsettling quiet settled over the cabin. Outside, the forest seemed to press closer, the towering pines swaying gently despite the absence of wind. Luke wandered onto the porch, drawn by the sound of leaves crunching underfoot. "Did you hear that?" he asked, peering into the darkness. "Hear what?" Rachel called from inside. "I don't know," Luke replied, his voice uncertain. It sounded like someone walking. Rachel stepped onto the porch, brushing off his concern. "It's probably just an animal. Go wash up for dinner." She pulled him inside, but not before casting a wary glance into the woods herself. As night fell, the family gathered around the dining table. Mark shared stories of his childhood camping trips, and Luke listened intently, his earlier apprehension forgotten. But Emma remained distracted, her fingers tapping a silent rhythm on the table. "I swear I saw someone out there earlier," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the jovial atmosphere. Mark raised an eyebrow. "Someone? Out here?" "Yeah, like a shadow. It was gone before I could get a good look," she replied. "It's just your imagination," Rachel said, though her tone was less convincing than she intended. After dinner, the family settled in for the night. Luke and Emma shared a room, their beds separated by a narrow aisle. While Luke drifted off quickly, Emma lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The cabin creaked with age, each sound amplified in the stillness. She turned toward the window, only to freeze. A pair of faint, glowing lights hovered just beyond the glass, too high to be animal eyes, but too low to be stars. She bolted upright, her heart racing as she grabbed her phone and aimed its flashlight toward the window. The lights vanished instantly, leaving only the reflection of her own wide-eyed face staring back. "Emma, what's wrong?" Luke murmured, half asleep. "Nothing," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Go back to sleep?" But as she lay back down, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them. Outside, the whispering pines swayed in the darkness, their secrets hidden in the shadows. The morning sun filtered through the pine branches, scattering golden beams across the forest floor. The cabin, now bathed in daylight, seemed less foreboding, almost serene. Mark was the first awake, stepping out onto the porch with a mug of steaming coffee. He inhaled the crisp morning air, the aroma of pine mingling with the earthy scent of dew. For a moment, the unease of the previous night felt like a distant memory. Inside, Rachel was busy preparing breakfast, the clatter of pans breaking the cabin's early morning stillness. Luke sat at the table, sketching the towering trees he had seen the day before. His vivid imagination turned them into fantastical creatures, their limbs twisted into monstrous shapes. "I'm drawing a tree monster," he announced proudly, holding up his sketch. Rachel chuckled. "Let's hope that stays in your drawing and doesn't show up outside." Emma, however, was less enthusiastic about the new day. She descended the stairs groggily, her face pale and her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Did anyone else hear weird noises last night?" she asked, her voice heavy with irritation. Mark glanced at her over his coffee mug. "It's an old cabin, Em. It creaks and groans. That's what old buildings do." Emma didn't argue but sat quietly at the table, her gaze fixed on the window. Outside, the forest seemed endless, the trees stretching far into the horizon. But there was something about the clearing where the cabin stood, an unnatural openness that felt out of place. It was as if the trees had deliberately stopped growing in that circle, leaving the cabin exposed. After breakfast, the family decided to explore the surrounding area. Mark led the way, carrying a small map he had picked up from the cabin's entryway. The trail began just beyond the clearing, winding through dense thickets of pine and birch. The deeper they ventured, the quieter the forest became. Even the birds seemed to avoid this part of the woods. "Is it just me, or does it feel off here?" Rachel asked, breaking the silence. "Maybe it's just the quiet," Mark replied, though his voice lacked conviction. Luke skipped ahead, his boundless energy undeterred. He stumbled upon a small wooden structure tucked between the trees. "Look at this," he called out. The family gathered around to inspect what appeared to be an old well, its stones moss-covered and crumbling with age. A rusted bucket hung from a frayed rope, swaying slightly despite the absence of wind. The air around the well felt colder, sending a shiver down Rachel's spine. "Don't go near that," she said firmly, pulling Luke back. "But it's just a well," he protested. "Better safe than sorry," Mark interjected, steering the group away. But as they moved further down the trail, Emma lagged behind. She felt drawn to the well, as if it were calling to her. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see those glowing lights from the night before. By midday, the family returned to the cabin, their mood subdued. The discovery of the well lingered in their minds, unspoken but ever-present. As Rachel prepared lunch, she noticed something peculiar. The vintage photographs on the walls had changed. The smiling faces of past visitors seemed blurred, their features distorted, as if someone had smeared the images with a wet brush. "Mark, come look at this," she called out, her voice tinged with alarm. He joined her, frowning as he examined the photos. "That's strange. Maybe it's just old film degrading." Emma, overhearing, walked into the room and froze when she saw the photos. One of them caught her eye, a young girl standing in front of the cabin, her face turned toward the forest. Unlike the others, her image wasn't blurred. It was crystal clear. "Who is she?" Emma asked, pointing at the girl. Mark shrugged. "No idea. Probably a guest from years ago." But Emma wasn't convinced. The girl's expression seemed wrong, too knowing, too alive for a photograph. As she stared, she could swear the girl's eyes shifted slightly, gazing directly at her. That night, as the family settled in, the forest outside seemed to come alive. The whispering of the pines grew louder, almost rhythmic, like a chant carried on the wind. And beneath it all, faint and distant, came the sound of something scraping against stone. The cabin, now cloaked in the shadows of night, seemed smaller, more confined. Each creak of the wooden planks beneath their feet felt amplified, a constant reminder of its age and isolation. Mark sat on the couch by the fire, flipping through an old book he'd found on the cabin's shelf. The book, bound in faded leather, was filled with handwritten entries and strange diagrams, the text nearly illegible in the dim light. Rachel was in the kitchen, organizing supplies while Emma and Luke played a board game on the floor. The crackling of the fire filled the silence, but there was an undercurrent to the stillness, an almost imperceptible hum, like the cabin itself was alive and breathing. As Luke leaned forward to move his game piece, he stopped abruptly, his head tilting as if listening. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Emma replied, glancing up from the game. "A noise. Like scratching. It's coming from the floor." Mark looked up from his book, frowning. "It's probably just mice. Old cabins like this are full of them." But Luke shook his head, his expression serious. "It doesn't sound like mice. It sounds bigger." Rachel joined them, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What's going on?" "Luke thinks there's something under the floor," Emma said, rolling her eyes. Rachel knelt down beside her son, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's just your imagination. Let's not scare ourselves over nothing." But the sound came again, soft but deliberate. It was a low, rhythmic scraping, like nails dragging across wood. This time, everyone heard it. Rachel's hand tightened on Luke's shoulder, and Mark set the book aside, standing up. "Okay, I'll check it out," Mark said, grabbing a flashlight from the mantel. He crouched near the edge of the living room, where the floorboard seemed slightly loose, and shone the beam of light into the thin gaps between the planks. The space beneath the floor was dark and narrow, barely large enough for a raccoon, but the sound persisted. "See anything?" Rachel asked, her voice tense. "Just cobwebs and dirt," Mark replied, though his tone lacked conviction. He pressed his ear to the floor, listening intently. The sound stopped abruptly, as if it had been aware of his presence. Mark stood and forced a chuckle. Probably just the wood settling. "It's nothing," but his words didn't ease the growing unease in the room. Later that evening, after the children had gone to bed, Rachel confronted Mark in the kitchen. "You're not telling me everything," she said quietly, her eyes narrowing. "What did you hear down there?" Mark hesitated, running a hand through his hair. "It's hard to explain. It didn't sound like an animal. It was deliberate, like someone was dragging something heavy." Rachel's face paled. "Do you think it could be someone? Maybe that shadow Emma saw?" "I don't know," Mark admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Upstairs, Emma lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. The strange sounds from below had unsettled her, but it was the photograph of the girl that lingered in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the girl's face, her dark eyes unblinking. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from downstairs, followed by the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. Emma bolted upright, her heart pounding. "Luke, wake up!" she hissed, shaking her brother awake. "What's going on?" he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Something's happening downstairs," Emma replied, already moving toward the door. The siblings crept down the stairs, their footsteps muffled by the thick rug. At the bottom, they found Mark and Rachel standing frozen near the fireplace. A single floorboard had been pried loose, exposing the dark crawl space below. The flashlight lay on the ground, its beam pointing into the void. But what caught Emma's attention was the object resting on the exposed dirt. An old, rusted key, its surface caked with grime. It looked like it hadn't seen the light of day in decades. Mark bent down, picking up the key carefully. "Where did this come from?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The sound returned, louder this time, echoing up from the crawl space. It was accompanied by something else, a faint whisper, almost indistinguishable from the creaking of the cabin. Rachel grabbed Emma and Luke, pulling them back. "We're leaving first thing in the morning," she said firmly, her voice shaking. But the cabin seemed to have other plans. The key sat on the kitchen table, its rusted surface gleaming faintly in the weak light of the cabin. Mark had spent the morning examining it, turning it over in his hands, searching for any clue to its origin. Its weight felt disproportionate, heavy not just with iron, but with the questions it brought. The unease from the night before clung to the family, like the morning fog that hung low in the forest outside. Rachel was adamant. "We need to leave. Whatever is going on here, it's not normal." Mark glanced out the window at their parked car. "We can't just pack up and go. The nearest town is miles away, and we barely have enough gas to get halfway there. Then we'll call someone. Get a tow, anything," Rachel insisted. But when Emma, who had been sitting near the cabin's old rotary phone, lifted the receiver, Her face fell. "It's dead," she said flatly. Rachel's stomach churned as she exchanged a glance with Mark. They checked the phone the day they arrived. It had worked then. Now, the crackling static on the line sounded like mocking laughter. Mark tried to keep his voice calm. "We'll leave first thing tomorrow then. I'll conserve the gas, and we'll make it to town. For now, let's stick together and stay inside." The family spent the rest of the day in a tense silence, avoiding the crawl space and keeping the rusted key in sight. Luke stayed close to Rachel, his usual energy replaced by a quiet wariness. Emma, however, couldn't stop thinking about the whisper she'd heard the night before. It hadn't been just a noise, it had been a voice. By late afternoon, the shadows of the forest began to creep closer to the cabin, stretching long and thin as the sun dipped low. Mark suggested they play a board game to keep their minds occupied, and for a while, it seemed to work. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the cabin felt almost normal again. But as night fell, the atmosphere shifted. The comforting noises of the forest, the rustle of leaves, the occasional chirp of crickets, were replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. It was the kind of quiet that made every creak of the cabin feel deafening. Rachel tried to distract herself by cleaning up after dinner. As she rinsed a plate, her eyes wandered to the window above the sink. The glass reflected the warm glow of the cabin, but beyond that, the forest loomed, impenetrable and dark. For a moment, she thought she saw movement, a flicker of light weaving through the trees. "Mark," she called, her voice trembling. He was at her side in an instant. "What is it?" "There's something out there," she whispered, pointing to the window. Mark peered into the darkness, his face tense. "Probably just fireflies," he said, though he didn't sound convinced. But then the light returned, closer this time. It wasn't a firefly. It was a steady, pulsating glow, moving methodically toward the cabin. A second light joined it, then a third. They bobbed and swayed, as though carried by unseen hands. The family gathered near the window, their fear palpable. Luke clung to Rachel's leg, his small hands trembling. Emma's eyes were wide, her face pale as she whispered, "They're lanterns." Mark backed away from the window, pulling the curtains shut. Everyone upstairs. Now, the family huddled in the small upstairs bedroom, the door locked behind them. Mark held the rusted key tightly in his hand, as if it could somehow protect them. They sat in silence, listening. At first, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing. Then, the whispers began. They were faint at first, rising and falling like the wind, but soon they grew louder, more distinct. Words formed, though the language was unrecognizable. The whispers surrounded the cabin, filling every corner, seeping through the walls. Rachel clutched Luke to her chest, her heart pounding. "What do they want?" she whispered. Mark shook his head, his knuckles white around the key. "I don't know." Emma crawled to the window, peeking through a gap in the curtains. The lights were gone, but something else had replaced them. Shadows moved across the clearing, figures with long, gangly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. They circled the cabin, their movements jerky and erratic, like marionettes controlled by an unskilled puppeteer. "They're trying to get in," Emma said, her voice barely audible. Mark's grip tightened on the key as he stared at the locked bedroom door. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if demanding something. And deep beneath the floorboards, that rhythmic scraping began again. The whispers and scraping beneath the cabin reached a crescendo, a maddening symphony that seemed to vibrate through the walls. The family clung to one another, the locked bedroom door their only barrier against whatever horrors prowled outside. Mark sat near the door, the rusted key clenched in his fist, his face set in grim determination. Rachel held Luke tightly, rocking him in a futile attempt to soothe his trembling body, while Emma stared out the window, her pale face illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. "Do you think they can get in?" Emma asked, her voice barely audible over the dissonant sounds that filled the cabin. "I don't know," Mark admitted, "but we're not going to give them a chance. We stay here until sunrise." The idea of waiting felt unbearable, especially as the figures outside continued their erratic dance around the cabin. Their limbs stretched and contracted, bending in impossible ways. At times, their movements seemed deliberate, as if performing a ritual. Then, as abruptly as they had begun, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive, almost louder than the noise it replaced. For a moment, the family sat frozen, straining their ears for any sign of what might come next. A loud crash shattered the silence, followed by the sound of splintering wood. It wasn't the front door. It came from below. Mark's eyes widened as he realized what had happened. "They've broken through the floor," he said, his voice tight with fear. Rachel's grip on Luke tightened. "We need to get out of here." But as she spoke, a new sound emerged, one that sent chills down their spines. It was a deep, guttural groaning, as if the very earth beneath the cabin was alive and in pain. The groaning grew louder, accompanied by the thudding of footsteps. Whatever was beneath them was moving, and it was coming closer. Emma turned away from the window, her expression one of dawning realization. "The key," she said, looking at Mark. "What if it's for something important? Something that can stop all of this?" Mark hesitated, staring at the key in his hand. "You think this thing is part of all this?" "It has to be," Emma insisted. "Why else would it show up when it did?" Mark nodded reluctantly, standing up. "There's a locked door in the hallway downstairs. It's the only place we haven't checked. Stay here. I'll see what's behind it." Rachel grabbed his arm, her eyes wide with panic. "You're not going down there alone." "I don't have a choice," Mark said, his voice firm. "If there's any chance this key can stop whatever's happening, I have to try." Before Rachel could argue further, the sound of the footsteps grew louder, now accompanied by a wet, slithering noise. The family looked at each other, their fear mirrored in one another's faces. "I'm coming with you," Emma said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Mark shook his head, but Emma was already at his side. "I'm not staying up here while you face this alone," she said. Mark didn't argue further. Together, they crept out of the bedroom, the rusted key heavy in Mark's hand. The hallway was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the moon filtering through the windows. The air was thick, suffused with a metallic scent that made Emma's stomach churn. They reached the locked door at the end of the hallway. Mark hesitated, his hand trembling as he inserted the key into the lock. It fit perfectly, the mechanism clicking with a sound that seemed to echo through the cabin. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase that descended into darkness. A foul odor wafted up from below, so strong that Emma gagged. "What is that?" she whispered, covering her nose with her sleeve. Mark didn't answer. He stepped onto the first stair, the wood groaning beneath his weight. Emma followed close behind, her flashlight illuminating the descent. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a small, stone-walled room. The walls were covered in strange carvings, symbols and figures that seemed to writhe in the flickering light of Emma's flashlight. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and atop it lay an ancient book, its pages yellowed and brittle. Mark approached the pedestal cautiously, his eyes scanning the carvings. "This is a ritual chamber," he muttered. Emma's gaze fell to the book. The text was written in a language she didn't recognize, but the illustrations were clear enough. Figures performing rituals, summoning something from beneath the ground. Before Mark could react, the groaning noise from above grew louder, shaking the very walls of the chamber. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the footsteps sounded like they were directly overhead. "We need to leave," Emma said, her voice urgent. But Mark's attention was fixed on the book. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the pages. "This isn't just a ritual. It's a binding spell," he said. "Whatever's out there, it was summoned. This book might be the only way to stop it." Emma's heart raced as the sounds above grew louder, more chaotic. "Then figure it out fast," she said, gripping Mark's arm, "because I don't think we have much time." The oppressive groaning of the cabin structure above felt like a countdown, each creak and tremor urging Mark and Emma to move faster. Mark's fingers trembled as he flipped through the brittle pages of the book, its ancient symbols and faded illustrations almost alive in the dim flashlight's glow. Emma's eyes darted between the staircase they had descended and the symbols carved into the stone walls, her mind racing to piece together a plan of escape. "What does it say? Can you read any of it?" Emma whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the groaning noise. "It's not English," Mark replied, his tone edged with frustration. "But the pictures, they show some kind of ritual. People in robes, a circle, something being buried under the ground." He turned the page, revealing an illustration of a monstrous figure emerging from beneath the earth, surrounded by bodies. Emma's breath hitched. "Barry? You mean whatever's out that was put underground on purpose?" Mark nodded grimly. "That's my guess. This book is like an instruction manual. How to summon it and, maybe, how to contain it." The slithering sound from above became louder, as if the creatures were pooling directly over their heads. Emma tightened her grip on the flashlight, its beam quivering as her hands shook. "If this is the only way to stop it, then we need to figure it out now. What's the containment part?" Mark's eyes scanned the page, his forehead slick with sweat. "It looks like a seal," he said, pointing to a rough sketch of a circular design. "If this seal is restored, it might stop whatever's happening." But his voice trailed off as he flipped to the next page, revealing a more detailed diagram of the seal. It was a massive, intricate symbol etched into the earth itself. Emma leaned over his shoulder. "Wait, that looks like the clearing behind the cabin. I saw it earlier when we were hiking." Mark's eyes widened. "If the seal is out there, we need to get to it." "But it's damaged. Look," he said, tracing a jagged crack in the illustration. "We need to fix it. There are instructions here for how to redraw it." The ground beneath their feet vibrated suddenly, the stone walls emitting a low rumble. Dust fell from the ceiling, and the footsteps above became erratic, as if the creatures were pacing frantically. Emma grabbed Mark's arm. "We can't stay here. If they figure out we're down here, we're trapped. We need to move." Mark nodded, clutching the book tightly. They ascended the staircase cautiously, each creak of the steps a potential beacon for whatever lurked above. When they reached the hallway, the oppressive silence of the cabin made Emma's ears ring. The door to the room they had left Rachel and Luke in was ajar, a faint beam of moonlight spilling into the hallway. Emma's stomach twisted as she pushed the door open. Rachel and Luke were gone. The blankets on the bed were tangled, the pillow on the floor. Luke's stuffed bear lay abandoned near the corner of the room. Mark picked it up, his face pale, as he scanned the space. "They wouldn't have left willingly," he whispered, his voice cracking. Emma's eyes darted to the window. The glass was intact, but faint muddy smears trailed from the sill to the floor, as if someone, or something, had climbed in and taken them. A faint sound drew their attention, a soft humming, barely audible over the creaking of the cabin. It came from outside, a low, rhythmic chant that made Emma's skin crawl. She and Mark exchanged a glance, then crept toward the front door. Peering through the cracked wood, they saw a sight that made their blood run cold. In the clearing behind the cabin, the grotesque figures they had glimpsed earlier stood in a perfect circle, their distorted limbs raised toward the sky. In the center of the circle stood Rachel and Luke, their faces blank, their bodies swaying in time with the chant. "We have to stop this," Mark said, his voice filled with equal parts terror and determination. "Whatever they're doing, it's tied to that seal. If we can fix it, maybe we can break their hold." Emma nodded, though her hands shook violently as she gripped the flashlight. "Then we go to the clearing," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We fix the seal, and we get them back." But as they stepped outside, the chanting figures turned as one, their hollow eyes locking onto Mark and Emma. The sound of their synchronized movements, bones cracking and limbs twisting, filled the night air, and the two realized they had just become the center of the ritual. The night was suffocatingly dark, the air thick with an otherworldly tension that pressed down on Mark and Emma as they stepped out of the cabin. The grotesque figures in the clearing moved with unnerving precision, their chants warping the silence into an eerie symphony of discord. Mark clutched the ancient book tightly to his chest, its brittle pages vibrating with the rhythm of the chant, as if alive. Emma's flashlight flickered, and she smacked it against her palm, whispering a curse under her breath. The beam steadied, illuminating the forest path that led to the clearing. Every step felt like an act of defiance against the overwhelming fear that clawed at her mind. "They're watching us," Emma muttered, her eyes darting toward the figures. Their hollow, glowing eyes followed every movement, yet they made no effort to approach. The circle remained unbroken, its members swaying like reeds in an invisible current. Mark flipped through the book, his eyes scanning the pages frantically as they walked. "We need to restore the seal," he said, his voice trembling. "The instructions mentioned chalk or ash, but I think anything that can draw the symbols might work." "Like what? Dirt? Blood?" Emma shot back, her voice tinged with panic. Mark hesitated. "If it comes to that, maybe, but let's hope we can find something else first." The clearing was larger than it had seemed in daylight, the faint outline of the seal carved into the earth barely visible under the moonlight. Emma's flashlight beam caught the jagged lines of the design, confirming their worst fears. The seal was indeed fractured, a gaping crack running through its center. The chanting figures shifted, their swaying intensifying. Rachel and Luke stood at the heart of the seal, their faces eerily blank, as if they were puppets strung along by the invisible threads of the ritual. Emma crouched by the edge of the seal, her fingers tracing the grooves in the dirt. "It's shallow," she whispered. "We can redraw this. Maybe the flashlight's battery can burn the lines back in." She was grasping at straws, but desperation made her resourceful. Mark knelt beside her, flipping to the page with the seal's diagram. "We have to match this exactly," he said, his voice tightening. "One mistake, and we might make things worse." "Worse? I think worse is already here," Emma snapped, though her anger was more fear than frustration. Mark ignored her, focusing intently on the task. He dug through his backpack, pulling out a pen. It wasn't ideal, but it was something. He began tracing the lines carefully, his hand trembling as he connected the broken pieces of the design. As the first complete section of the seal took shape, the chanting faltered. The figures swayed more erratically, their movements disjointed. A low, guttural growl erupted from the woods, the sound reverberating through the clearing. Emma's head snapped up, her heart pounding. "What was that?" "I don't know, but keep watch," Mark said, his voice tight. "I need to finish this." The growl grew louder, and the figures in the circle began to shift, their hollow eyes turning to the forest's edge. Something massive stirred in the shadows, its presence palpable even before it emerged into view. A grotesque, otherworldly creature lumbered into the clearing. Its elongated limbs and distorted features defied logic, its body a writhing mass of twisted flesh and bone. The ground beneath it withered as it moved, the air growing colder with each step. Emma's breath hitched. "Mark, hurry!" she shouted, her voice trembling as she backed toward him. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar, and the figures in the circle collapsed to the ground, their chanting ceasing abruptly. Rachel and Luke remained motionless, their expressions unchanged, as if caught in a trance. Mark's pen scratched furiously across the dirt, his hands moving faster than he thought possible. "Almost there," he yelled, his voice cracking under the pressure. The creature lunged toward them, its movements slow but deliberate. Emma grabbed a stick, wielding it like a weapon despite knowing it would do little against the monstrosity. She positioned herself between Mark and the creature, her knees shaking, but her resolve unwavering. The final line of the seal connected with a spark of energy, a faint glow emanating from the design. The creature recoiled, its distorted form writhing in pain as the seal's power forced it back. Mark and Emma stared in disbelief as the glow intensified, the seal pulsating with an otherworldly light. But as the creature retreated, its guttural growl turned into a chilling laugh, a sound that echoed in their ears long after it disappeared into the shadows. The clearing fell silent, the figures lying motionless on the ground. Rachel and Luke blinked, their expressions softening as if waking from a dream. "We did it," Mark whispered, though his voice lacked conviction. Emma shook her head, her eyes fixed on the seal. "No," she said quietly. It's not over. That thing, it was just the beginning. The glow of the newly restored seal faded gradually, leaving Mark, Emma, Rachel, and Luke in a dim, unsettling silence. The air felt heavy, charged with an oppressive energy that clung to their skin like static. Though the creature had retreated, a chilling sense of foreboding remained, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. Rachel stumbled forward, her legs shaky. "What just happened?" she muttered, her voice weak. Her eyes darted to the faint lines of the seal beneath her feet, a flicker of recognition sparking in her expression. "You don't remember?" Emma asked, her voice sharper than intended. She kept glancing at the shadows, her grip on the makeshift weapon still tight. Rachel hesitated, then looked at Luke, who seemed equally dazed. "We were in the cabin. There was a sound like whispering, and then she stopped, shaking her head. It's all blank after that." Luke's gaze drifted to the forest, his face pale. "I remember something pulling me. I couldn't move on my own." He shuddered. It felt like drowning, but not in water. In something thicker. Mark wiped his forehead, smearing dirt across his face. "You were both in the center of the seal," he explained, his voice low. "You were part of the ritual." Rachel took a step back, horror dawning in her eyes. "What do you mean, part of it?" Mark hesitated, the words catching in his throat. "I don't know how else to put it. You weren't yourselves. Whatever broke the seal, it took hold of you." Before anyone could respond, a faint rumble vibrated through the ground, like a distant earthquake. The sound was deep and resonant, more felt than heard. The group froze, exchanging wary glances. "What now?" Emma muttered, her voice trembling. The rumble grew louder, accompanied by a strange rhythmic thumping. It wasn't coming from the forest, but beneath their feet. The earth itself seemed to pulse, as though a heartbeat emanated from the soil. "Is it the creature?" Luke asked, his voice barely audible. Mark crouched, pressing his hand to the ground. "I don't think so," he said, frowning. "This feels different, more controlled." The pulsing grew stronger, and the seal began to glow faintly once more. The group stepped back instinctively, the lines of the seal pulsating with the same rhythm as the earth. A low hum filled the air, resonating in their bones. Suddenly, the seal cracked open, a jagged line splitting the earth within its boundaries. From the fissure emerged not another monstrous entity, but a strange, crystalline object. It was roughly the size of a football, its surface smooth and black, yet it seemed to absorb the faint light around it. "What is that?" Emma whispered, her eyes wide. Mark approached cautiously, his curiosity overcoming his fear. "It's some kind of artifact," he said, reaching out a trembling hand. "Don't touch it," Rachel cried, grabbing his arm. But it was too late. Mark's fingers brushed the surface of the crystal, and the hum escalated into a deafening roar. The group clamped their hands over their ears, but the sound was not external. It was inside their heads, reverberating like a tidal wave of noise. The forest around them seemed to react, the trees swaying violently despite the absence of wind. Shadows twisted unnaturally, darting between the trunks like living entities. The crystalline artifact emitted a pulse of light, and in an instant, the group was blinded. When the light faded, they found themselves standing not in the clearing, but in an entirely different place. The forest was gone, replaced by a barren, rocky landscape under a sky choked with swirling black clouds. The air was thick and metallic, carrying a faint, acrid scent. "What just happened?" Emma asked, her voice shaky as she turned in circles, trying to make sense of their surroundings. Mark held the crystal tightly, his knuckles white. "I think," he said slowly, "we're not in the forest anymore." Rachel's eyes widened as she pointed to the horizon. "Look!" Far in the distance, a towering structure loomed, a jagged, black spire that seemed to stretch endlessly into the roiling sky. Its surface shimmered faintly, as if alive. "This isn't real," Luke muttered, his voice cracking. "It can't be." Mark glanced down at the crystal in his hand. Its surface was now glowing faintly, pulsing in sync with his heartbeat. "I don't think this place is a hallucination," he said grimly. "Whatever this artifact is, it brought us here." and I think it's showing us where to go." The group exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of their predicament settling heavily over them. The barren landscape stretched endlessly in every direction, offering no choice but to move forward, toward the spire and whatever new horrors awaited them there. The barren wasteland stretched endlessly in every direction, a bleak expanse of jagged rocks and ash-colored soil. The group trudged forward, the black spire looming ominously on the horizon. Its sharp, angular shape seemed almost too perfect, as though it had been crafted by an unnatural hand. The swirling clouds above crackled faintly with electricity, their roiling patterns casting eerie, shifting shadows on the ground. Mark held the crystal tightly, its faint glow providing a small sense of direction in an otherwise featureless void. His fingers had gone numb from clutching it, but he couldn't bring himself to let go. "Stay close," he said, his voice steady but strained. Emma walked beside him, her eyes darting nervously around their surroundings. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Feel what?" Rachel replied, glancing at Emma. "It's like we're being watched," Emma said, shivering. Luke, trailing slightly behind, stopped and turned. His gaze swept the desolate landscape, his face pale. "She's right. Something's out there." Mark paused, scanning the horizon. At first, he saw nothing but the same lifeless terrain. But then, just at the edge of his vision, something shifted. A dark shape flitted between two jagged rocks, too quick to be fully seen. "There!" he whispered sharply, pointing. The others turned in unison, but whatever had been there was gone. The silence that followed was oppressive, broken only by the faint sound of their own breathing. "Keep moving," Mark urged, his grip on the crystal tightening. "Whatever it is, we can't stop now." The group pressed on, the spire growing larger and more imposing with each step. The ground beneath their feet began to change, the soft, ashen soil giving way to smooth, black stone. Strange markings began to appear, etched into the surface like ancient runes. They glowed faintly, the same eerie light as the crystal. "What do these mean?" Rachel asked, running her fingers over one of the symbols. Mark shook his head. "I don't know, but they feel familiar." As they continued, the runes became more intricate, forming patterns that seemed almost alive. They twisted and writhed, their shapes shifting imperceptibly when looked at directly. The group stopped when they reached the base of the spire. Up close, it was even more intimidating, its surface smooth and cold like obsidian. The runes climbed its surface in spiraling patterns, converging at a single point near the top where a faint, pulsating light emanated. "There's a door," Luke said, pointing to a narrow opening in the spire. The entrance was framed by runes that seemed to ripple like water. Mark stepped forward cautiously, the crystal in his hand glowing brighter with each step. As he approached, the runes around the door flared with light, and the entrance widened, revealing a dark corridor leading inside. "Is this really the only way?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. Mark glanced back at the others, his face grim. "Do we have a choice?" With no other option, they entered the spire. The air inside was colder, the metallic scent stronger. The walls were lined with the same glowing runes, their light just bright enough to illuminate the narrow passage. The group moved carefully, their footsteps echoing in the silence. The corridor twisted and turned, the runes on the walls pulsing rhythmically, as though in time with a heartbeat. After what felt like hours, they emerged into a vast chamber. The ceiling stretched high above, disappearing into darkness. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it sat a second crystal, identical to the one Mark carried. "What is this place?" Rachel asked, her voice filled with awe and dread. Before anyone could answer, the runes on the walls flared brightly, and the door behind them slammed shut. A low, guttural sound echoed through the chamber, sending chills down their spines. The pedestal began to glow, and the second crystal floated into the air. Its light grew brighter and brighter until it was blinding. The group shielded their eyes, their hearts pounding with fear. When the light faded, a figure stood before them. It was humanoid but impossibly tall, its body made of shifting shadows and faintly glowing runes. Its eyes were twin orbs of light, staring down at them with an intensity that froze them in place. "You have trespassed," the figure said, its voice reverberating through the chamber like thunder. "And now, you must decide." The group exchanged terrified glances, the weight of their predicament crashing down on them. Whatever this place was, it demanded something from them, something none of them were prepared to give. The towering figure before them, a mass of shadows and glowing runes, loomed with an unsettling presence. Its eyes, two pools of light, seemed to pierce through them, seeing far beyond their physical forms and into the depths of their souls. The air grew colder. Each breath mark, Emma, Rachel, and Luke took now carrying an almost suffocating weight. The silence that followed the figure's words seemed to stretch on for an eternity, thick with an oppressive tension. "You have trespassed," the figure repeated, its voice like an ancient storm rumbling from the deepest recesses of the earth. It was not a question nor a threat. It was simply a statement. "What do you want from us?" Mark finally asked, his voice more steady than he felt. His grip on the crystal tightened, as though it could offer him some kind of defense against the overwhelming presence in front of him. The figure shifted slightly, its form fluid, as though it were not entirely bound by the laws of matter. It did not speak at once, but instead, the room around them seemed to pulse, the runes on the walls and the pedestal glowing brighter. "The artifact you carry," the figure said after a long pause, "is not simply a tool. It is a key, one that opens a door to realms you cannot comprehend. It carries the weight of choices made long ago, and now you must decide whether you will carry that weight further." Rachel, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. Her eyes were wide, but there was something defiant in her expression. "Decide what? What are you asking us to do?" The figure's gaze shifted to her, its eyes narrowing. "The path ahead leads to either destruction or salvation. The question is not whether you will succeed or fail, but what price you are willing to pay for the knowledge you seek." Emma, trembling slightly, looked to Mark. "We didn't ask for this. We didn't come here looking for." Her voice faltered. "We just wanted to leave. We wanted to go back." The figure seemed to consider her words, and for a moment, it almost looked as though it might speak again. But then the ground beneath them rumbled, and a low, resonant hum filled the chamber. The pedestal at the center of the room began to rise slowly, the second crystal floating just above it. Its light flickered, revealing strange, shifting symbols on its surface, symbols that matched the ones now glowing on the walls. They all seemed to pulse in unison, and for a moment, Mark felt an almost magnetic pull towards it. He reached out instinctively, but then stopped himself, the weight of the figure's gaze pressing on him. "Do not be deceived," the figure warned, its voice a low growl. "That crystal holds a truth you are not ready to know. It will bind you to this place, to the very fabric of what you have awakened. To take it would be to sacrifice not just your lives, but the future itself." The air seemed to thicken with the weight of the figure's words, as though the entire chamber was closing in around them. The room, which had been vast and foreboding just moments ago, now felt small and suffocating. Each breath became harder to take, as though the very atmosphere was being squeezed out of their lungs. Mark swallowed hard. He had come to realize something in that moment. The creature before them was not offering them a simple choice. It was offering them an impossible one. The future was not simply laid out for them to choose from. It was something far more dangerous. "What happens if we refuse?" Rachel asked, her voice hoarse. The figure's eyes flickered with an eerie gleam. "Refusal has consequences, but so does acceptance. Every action taken here will ripple through time and space. You cannot unmake what has been set in motion. You are bound to this place, whether you choose to stay or leave." For the first time since entering the spire, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. He looked at his friends, their faces drawn with fear and confusion, and wondered if they would survive this encounter at all. "What do you want us to do?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure did not immediately respond. Instead, the light around them intensified, and the runes along the walls grew brighter, more insistent. The air hummed with the same energy that had enveloped them since the moment they first stepped into the spire. "The only choice you have," the figure said, its voice now a low whisper, "is whether you will carry the burden of this power or destroy it. Your fate is intertwined with that of the crystal. But be warned, either choice will alter the world in ways you cannot foresee." The silence that followed was deafening. Each of them stood motionless, their hearts pounding in their chests, the enormity of their decision pressing down upon them. The figure waited patiently, as though it had all the time in the world. But Mark knew that they did not. He glanced at the glowing crystal in his hand, its energy thrumming against his palm, as if calling to him, as if it could sense his hesitation. And then he made a decision, not a choice made lightly, but one that seemed inevitable. He stepped forward. "We'll take it," he said quietly. "We'll carry the burden." The figure did not move, but Mark felt the air shift around him, as if the very fabric of the world was bending to his decision. It was not relief that followed, but a deep, unsettling sense of finality. He had chosen the path. There would be no turning back. The moment Mark spoke the words, the atmosphere in the chamber shifted. The heavy, suffocating air seemed to lighten, but only for an instant. The oppressive presence of the towering figure remained, its eyes still glowing with the intensity of an ancient force, watching them with quiet judgment. The crystal in Mark's hand pulsed, its light flickering like a heartbeat, as if acknowledging his decision. "You have chosen," the figure said, its voice now softer, almost contemplative. "Now, the burden is yours to carry." Mark's fingers tightened around the crystal. There was no turning back now. The weight of the object seemed to increase with each passing second, its glow intensifying until it almost burned against his skin. His mind raced as he felt a strange, alien energy begin to flow through him, as though the crystal were drawing something from within him, siphoning a part of his essence. Rachel, standing closest to him, reached out instinctively. "Mark, are you okay?" He nodded, though he felt far from it. The energy within the crystal was overwhelming. It thrummed with a resonance that seemed to echo in his bones, vibrating through every cell of his body. His vision blurred for a moment, and he nearly dropped the crystal, but he held on, the cold sensation of its surface grounding him in a reality that felt increasingly foreign. "Mark!" Emma's voice cut through the haze that was beginning to cloud his thoughts. She sounded panicked, her hand gripping his arm tightly. "What's happening? What's it doing to you?" For a brief moment, Mark couldn't answer. His mind was too consumed with the strange power coursing through him. The runes on the walls seemed to pulse in time with the crystal, their rhythmic flashing disorienting him. He could feel a connection, something deep and primal, that tied him to this place, to the spire, to the very core of the crystal. It was as though his consciousness was being pulled into an endless void, his identity slowly being eroded. "Mark!" Rachel shouted again, snapping him back to the present. He staggered slightly, blinking rapidly, trying to clear his mind. The sensation faded, but the burden remained, a constant pressure on his chest, a dark weight that seemed to have lodged itself deep within his soul. "Are you all right?" Rachel asked, her voice now softer, filled with concern. Mark opened his mouth to respond, but found that the words wouldn't come. The power inside him was still there, silent but constant. He could feel the crystal's pull, drawing him further into its mystery. He wanted to scream, to let go, but there was something else, something deeper, telling him to hold on, to keep the burden intact. The figure before them had remained silent throughout the exchange, but now it spoke once more, its voice both distant and close at the same time. "You have accepted what few before you have dared. But be warned, the cost of knowledge is high. The burden you now carry will change you, as it has changed all who have come before." The words were like a warning, a cold reminder of the perilous path they had chosen. Mark's mind swirled with confusion, with the weight of the choices that had led them here. But one thing was certain, whatever this was, it wasn't going to be easy. He could already feel the weight of his decision settling into his bones. Emma's hand was still on his arm, her grip tight. "Mark, we need to get out of here. This place, it's wrong. It's affecting you." Mark shook his head. "I can't. We need to figure this out. We have to understand what this is." Luke, who had been standing silently in the background, spoke up now, his voice cautious. "What if we can't? What if this thing changes everything? What if we're already too far gone?" Mark turned to face him, his expression hardening. "We're already in this. We either face it or let it consume us. But running won't change anything." Rachel's eyes narrowed as she glanced around the chamber. "I don't think we have the luxury of choice anymore. Look around, Mark. This place, this spire, it's not just a structure. It's a prison, and I don't think we're meant to leave." The realization hit Mark with the force of a crashing wave. She was right. The walls of the chamber, the pulsating runes, the oppressive presence of the figure. They were all designed to contain, to restrict. This wasn't a place meant for exploration. It was a place meant to hold something, or perhaps someone captive. And they were the ones trapped now. The figure, sensing the shift in their understanding, gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You are beginning to understand," it said. "But the question remains. Can you bear the weight of what you have chosen?" Mark's heart raced. The burden inside him was growing, the power within the crystal now seeping into his very essence, altering him in ways he could neither comprehend nor control. His mind flashed with visions, glimpses of places and events far beyond his understanding. He saw himself standing on a precipice, looking down into an abyss that stretched beyond time itself. The crystal, pulsing in his hand, seemed to be the only thing tethering him to reality. He could feel the pressure mounting, but there was no escape, no easy answers. "We're not leaving," he said, his voice a low whisper, the words coming from a place deep inside him. "Not unless we understand what this is. Not unless we face it head on." The figure's form seemed to ripple with approval. "So be it. But know this, your path from here on out is not one of simple choices. It is a path of transformation, a journey that will reshape all of you. The burden you carry will not remain light." With that, the figure's eyes flickered once more, and the chamber grew colder. The weight of their decision, the burden that now marked them, settled in, and there was no going back. Mark felt it most acutely, a dark shadow that whispered of things to come, things he couldn't yet understand, but that he would soon have no choice but to face. The oppressive atmosphere of the chamber had shifted once again, but this time, it was not merely a passing sensation. The walls seemed to hum with energy, the runes now swirling in a dizzying pattern. The crystal Mark held in his hand pulsed in time with the heartbeat of the spire itself, and the weight of its power pressed down on him like a physical force. Each breath he took felt labored, as though the very air had become thicker, more suffocating. It was in this charged silence that the fracture began, though none of them could have anticipated how it would unfold. At first, it was subtle, an almost imperceptible change in the way the runes glowed, a brief shift in the figure's expression, something imperceptible but unmistakable. Mark felt a ripple of unease through his chest, and he instinctively glanced around, as if searching for something he could not quite place. Rachel, who had been standing beside him, suddenly staggered back, her hand flying to her head. "Mark, something's wrong. I feel." Her words trailed off, but Mark could see the confusion and panic in her eyes. She looked as though she were struggling against some unseen force, as if something invisible was pushing against her from all sides. Emma's voice cut through the tension, sharp and commanding. "What's happening to her?" Mark turned to Rachel, his face filled with concern. Her skin was pale, and her eyes had a glazed, distant quality to them. The pulsating energy from the crystal had taken root in her, just as it had in him, but the effect was far more immediate and severe. It was as if whatever had begun in him was now manifesting with terrifying speed in her. "I don't know," Mark said, his voice strained, "but we need to get out of here. Now." But as he spoke, the chamber seemed to resist them, its very walls closing in. The runes flickered once again, and the figure's expression hardened. It raised one long, clawed hand, and the very air seemed to crackle with energy. "You cannot leave. Not now. The choice has been made. The path you walk is already set. Mark's heart skipped a beat. There was a finality in the figure's words, an unspoken truth that made the air grow even heavier. They were trapped. There was no escaping the consequences of their actions, no way to undo the decision they had made. The spire, the crystal, the force that seemed to govern this place, it all had them ensnared. Rachel's cries broke through Mark's thoughts. She was writhing on the ground now, her body twisting in unnatural ways, her face contorted in agony. Mark rushed to her side, but it was as if some unseen hand were pulling her further from him, making her body stretch and contort. "Rachel," he shouted, reaching for her. But as his hand neared, a sudden jolt of energy surged through the crystal in his own hand, and he was thrown back, crashing against the stone wall. The impact left him dazed, but the feeling of power, of control, surged within him once more. He could feel the crystal now, like an extension of his own being, its power coursing through him. He had no choice but to listen to its call. Emma, panicking, rushed toward Rachel, trying to help, but she too was struck by the same force, stumbling as though something were pushing against her. "It's not right," she gasped. "None of this feels right." As the situation spiraled further out of control, Mark realized the truth he had been unwilling to acknowledge until now. This place was changing them. The crystal was not just an artifact of power. It was a force of transformation, one that was altering them from within. And this change, this fracture, was not just happening to them physically. It was happening to their very essence. Suddenly, the spire seemed to tremble, and the ground beneath their feet cracked. The figure, standing motionless in the center of the room, spoke again, but its voice was no longer comforting. It was cold, detached. "This is the price. The fracturing has begun. The path you have chosen cannot be undone. You will feel the consequences for as long as you remain here." The walls groaned as though alive, the runes flickering with dangerous intensity. It was clear now that the fracture was not just a physical rupture. It was the beginning of something far more insidious. The space around them seemed to bend, the very laws of reality beginning to warp under the influence of the crystal's power. Mark stood, his legs unsteady beneath him, as he watched the chaos unfold. He was beginning to understand the cost of their choices. The figure's words were coming to fruition. This was no longer just a place of power. It was a prison, a trap. The crystal, the burden, it was designed to fracture them, to break them down into something unrecognizable. They had been chosen, but not for some noble cause. They had been chosen for a purpose far darker than they had ever imagined. The fracture had begun, and there would be no going back. The aftermath of the fracture was unlike anything they had ever imagined. The air around them was thick with an oppressive energy. Each breath they took seemed more difficult, and the very atmosphere felt charged with an electric hum. It was as if the spire had awakened, and with it, a storm of unseen forces had begun to stir. Mark could feel the weight of the crystal in his hand pressing against him, its power more intense than ever before. Yet, as much as he could sense its pull, there was an undeniable trepidation that gripped his heart. The fracture was only the beginning. Something more malevolent was on the horizon. As the trembling of the chamber subsided, the disorienting quiet that followed was almost suffocating. Rachel, still crumpled on the floor, was no longer moving. Her body lay unnaturally still, the pallor of her face now resembling that of a corpse. Mark, his heart racing, could not bring himself to approach her again. Not out of fear, but out of a deep, primal understanding that whatever had happened to her was beyond their control. Emma had fallen to her knees, her hands gripping the stone floor as she tried to steady herself. Her breath was ragged, and she was muttering to herself, a mixture of disbelief and desperation in her voice. "This can't be happening. It can't." Mark could feel the desperation in her voice too, but he knew she had no answers. No one did. The figure in the center of the room had faded into the shadows, its presence now lingering like an oppressive force, watching, waiting. It hadn't spoken since the fracture, but Mark knew it was far from done with them. He could sense its cold, calculating gaze following his every move. The consequences of their actions were still unfolding, and the storm that was brewing was one of far greater significance than any of them could comprehend. In a sudden burst of realization, Mark understood that the storm wasn't just an external phenomenon. It was something far more internal, a reflection of the change that had taken root in them all. It wasn't simply the spire that had been disturbed. The very fabric of their beings had been altered by the crystal's power. It had fractured their minds, their souls, and now they were at the mercy of whatever force had chosen them. The chamber had transformed too. Where once it had felt ancient and static, it now pulsed with life. The runes etched into the walls writhed like serpents, shifting and contorting, as if alive. The once immovable figure in the center was no longer static. It was beginning to move, slow and deliberate, as if it were awakening from a long slumber. Its eyes glowed faintly, and Mark could feel the air grow colder with every passing second. "We need to get out," Emma gasped, her voice trembling as she struggled to her feet. "Before it's too late." But Mark could not move. His body felt rooted to the spot, and the crystal in his hand began to hum louder, as if it were resonating with the energy that filled the room. It was a pull he could not resist, an invisible tether that kept him grounded. His thoughts swirled, and for a moment, he wondered if he was beginning to lose control of his own mind. The storm was not just a physical phenomenon. It was a mental storm, one that would erode their will to escape. It was breaking them down, piece by piece. Rachel's lifeless form lay at the center of the chamber now, and Mark couldn't help but look toward her. He didn't want to believe what had happened to her, but it was undeniable. Whatever the crystal had done to her had left her in a state that was no longer human. Her body had been altered, contorted in ways that made it clear she was no longer the person she once was. Mark could feel the weight of her loss hanging over him, and for a fleeting moment, he wondered if it was too late for all of them. Emma, still gasping for air, looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. "Mark, what are we going to do? If we don't get out now, we're going to end up like her. We'll all become..." She couldn't finish her sentence. The very idea of what they could become was too horrible to even articulate. Mark's thoughts were clouded, his mind grasping for a solution that seemed just out of reach. The storm raged both outside and inside them, and there seemed to be no safe haven left. Then, in an instant, the crystal in Mark's hand began to crack. A deep, resonating sound reverberated through the chamber, the crack widening with each passing second. Mark's heart skipped a beat. The storm had reached its apex, and the crystal, now the very source of their torment, was beginning to crumble. The energy that had pulsed so violently through him seemed to be leaking out, spilling over into the chamber. The figure's eyes blazed, and its voice, cold and final, rang through the air. "You are not meant to escape," it intoned. "You were never meant to leave." Mark's pulse quickened as the crystal shattered in his hand, releasing a burst of blinding light. The force knocked him backward, sending him crashing to the ground. When the light faded, the figure was gone. The chamber, once filled with the hum of power, was silent once again. But Mark knew the storm was far from over. It had only just begun. The fracture was complete, and whatever force they had unleashed had already begun its work. As the dust settled and the last remnants of light faded from the shattered crystal, Mark's mind was engulfed by an overwhelming sense of loss. His body, aching from the violent impact of the force, felt numb. It was as if the very life had been drained from him, leaving only an empty shell behind. His thoughts, however, were still racing as they tried to piece together what had just occurred. The figure, the entity that had watched them so intently, its presence cold and malevolent, was gone, but the threat had not dissipated. It lingered, deep and insidious, something that couldn't be erased by the simple disappearance of its physical manifestation. It had done its work, and now Mark feared it would never release them. He slowly lifted himself from the ground, his movements sluggish. Emma, who had been beside him moments before, was now nowhere to be seen. His heart skipped in panic as he scanned the dark chamber. "Emma!" His voice came out hoarse, cracked. The silence that followed only intensified his growing dread. She was gone, vanished without a trace. Had the storm claimed her? Was she simply another casualty of the fractured crystal's power? In the distance, a faint whisper echoed through the chamber. Mark froze. It wasn't Emma's voice. It was something else, something darker. It was as though the very air around him had been laced with an unseen presence, something that could not be directly perceived, yet could still be felt, a grip tightening ever so slowly around his mind and soul. He realized with a shudder that whatever had taken place in the moment of the crystal's destruction had already begun to affect him. The storm was not just external, it had entered him, and in that moment, he understood the true depth of the danger they were in. His hand instinctively went to his chest, as if he could stave off the sensation of being suffocated from within. Every breath he took felt strained, like there was something pressing against his ribs, squeezing tighter with each passing second. Mark staggered to his feet, his eyes darting around the chamber. There was no sign of Emma, nor of the figure, but the tension in the air had never been more palpable. The chamber, once a place of ancient mystery, now felt like a living, breathing entity. Its walls seemed to shift and pulse with a rhythm all their own. The runes etched into the stone glowed faintly, their once cryptic meanings now twisted and unintelligible, further adding to the mounting sense of unease. But it wasn't just the chamber that had changed. Mark could feel something stirring within him. His thoughts felt clouded, muddled by an outside influence. There was a whispering in the back of his mind, a voice that wasn't his own. He shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the grip tightened. His vision blurred momentarily, and he stumbled, feeling the ground beneath him give way. He caught himself just in time, leaning against the cold, damp stone wall for support. His heartbeat quickened as the whisper grew louder, louder until it was all he could hear. "Leave now," the voice hissed, an echoing whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You cannot escape. You will never escape." The words hung in the air like a curse, and Mark felt a surge of panic unlike anything he had ever known. What had they awakened? What force had they set into motion? His mind raced, struggling to hold onto any semblance of clarity. He had to find Emma. He had to find a way out. The storm, the unseen grip, was not just something affecting his mind. It was now affecting his very will to act. And yet, as he tried to focus, to summon the strength to move forward, the voice continued to echo in his mind, growing louder, more insistent. "It's too late," it sneered. "The storm has already begun. You are part of it now." Mark clenched his fists, desperately trying to push the voice away. He had to stay focused. There was no time to lose. His friends, his family, had been caught in this nightmare, and now it was his turn to fight back. But he knew, deep down, that the fight was not one of physical strength. It was one of mental fortitude, of resisting the intangible grip that had taken hold of him. He could feel the cold creeping in, the weight of the storm growing ever heavier. The walls seemed to press in on him, the runes twisting into shapes that resembled faces, eyes glaring at him from every corner. Mark closed his eyes tightly, but the images didn't fade. They were inside him now. The storm was inside him. His breaths came in shallow gasps, and his heart pounded erratically in his chest. Mark's hand reached out, instinctively touching the wall in front of him, hoping for something, anything, that might ground him. And then, just as his fingers brushed the stone, the sensation stopped. The storm in his mind faltered for a brief moment. It was as if the very contact with the cold stone had broken the connection, or at least weakened it. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself, trying to regain control. But it was only temporary. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. "You are not in control anymore," they warned. "You belong to it." Mark's resolve hardened. He would not be a victim. Not like Rachel, not like Emma, and not like the countless others who had fallen before them. There had to be a way to break free from this unseen storm. He refused to give in to the grip of whatever had been unleashed. And with a final, desperate breath, he made a decision. He would fight. Even if the storm inside him raged, he would find the strength to endure. Because there was no escape. Not from the storm, not from the force that held them all. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to survive it. And in that fleeting moment of clarity, Mark knew that the only way out was through. The storm Mark felt inside him was unlike any he had ever experienced. It wasn't a storm of rain or wind, but one of consciousness, twisting his thoughts into an ever-tightening knot. He tried to remember the room, the chamber, anything that could anchor him back to reality, but the whispers continued to erode his sense of self. His mind, once clear and focused, was now a battleground where external forces waged war on his every thought. The echoes of that same cold voice threatened to drown him in despair, to make him a puppet of the storm. Mark clenched his teeth, willing himself to push through the overwhelming tide of confusion. He was still standing, he was still breathing, and above all, he was still searching. Despite the growing sense of dread, he had to find Emma. He had to find the others. It was the only thing that mattered now. The rest, the force, the voices, the twisting chamber, was secondary. Their survival depended on his ability to hold on to the last thread of clarity he had. But just as Mark steadied himself, the world around him seemed to lurch. The stone walls of the chamber shifted. No, it wasn't the walls that moved, it was the very air. The oppressive weight in the room increased, and the shadows on the walls began to writhe, as though they were alive, feeding off the fear that permeated the space. Mark's pulse quickened as he watched, horrified, as the shadows grew longer and more distorted, crawling across the floor in unnatural patterns. The whispers returned, louder this time, swirling in his mind like a storm in its own right. "It's all around you," they hissed. "It's inside of you." It was always inside. Mark tried to shut them out, but the shadows on the walls seemed to pulse in time with the words, amplifying their menace. He could feel them, the shadows, moving closer, their edges curling and stretching towards him like dark tendrils. His stomach twisted in terror, and his breath came in quick, shallow gasps. His heart raced in his chest, and for the first time since the storm had begun, he feared he might lose himself entirely. Desperation drove him to move. Mark turned his back on the shifting shadows and began to walk, one slow step at a time. He had no particular direction in mind, only the instinct to escape the voices, the shadows, the storm that now seemed inescapable. But with each step he took, the chamber seemed to grow larger, its endless corridors stretching out like a maze. No matter how far he walked, he couldn't escape the walls, couldn't escape the shifting dark that followed him. And then, as though mocking his every attempt at flight, the ground beneath him gave way. Mark stumbled, nearly losing his balance as the floor cracked beneath his feet, sending a low rumble through the air. He braced himself against the sudden tremor, his pulse quickening again. But when the noise ceased, the shadows that had been following him suddenly vanished. The room fell eerily still. He dared not breathe. Had the storm subsided? Was this his chance to break free? He looked around, scanning every corner of the chamber, trying to find some semblance of meaning in the now silent, desolate space. The room appeared the same as before, but the oppressive tension was gone. The shadows had stopped shifting, the whispers had ceased. For the first time since the beginning of the storm, there was quiet. A false quiet. The calm before the inevitable return. Mark's heart slowed, but his mind was still clouded, still fighting the pull of whatever it was that had ensnared him. He had to find Emma. He had to find the others. They had to be close. He couldn't waste time in this place, whatever it was. His legs felt heavy, but he pushed forward again, one step after another, his body moving on sheer will. As he advanced, the silence grew unbearable. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence that comes with stillness, but the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck rise in alarm. The kind of silence that fills the air with a sense of impending doom. And just as Mark's uncertainty began to weigh him down, he heard it, faint at first, but unmistakable, the sound of footsteps. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. The footsteps were too light, too calculated, to be anyone he knew. He couldn't trust his senses. It was impossible. His mind, still under the influence of the storm, could not be trusted. And yet, despite this, the sound of the footsteps grew louder, closer. Someone or something was approaching him. He took a deep breath, his heart hammering in his chest. Slowly, he turned to face the source of the footsteps. The figure that emerged from the shadows was not Emma, but something else. A tall, gaunt figure with hollow eyes and a twisted, cruel grin on its face. Its form flickered, as if it were not entirely solid, its edges shimmering like a mirage. It was both there and not there. The figure did not speak, but its presence was a chilling confirmation of what Mark had feared all along. The storm was not just a force in his mind. It was real. The twisting shadows, the voices, the darkness. They were all part of something much larger, something he had only begun to understand. The figure's grin widened, and Mark realized that he was no longer simply trying to escape. He was facing the storm itself, an embodiment of it, standing before him, waiting. In that moment, Mark understood the terrible truth. The storm had been inside them all along, and now it was coming for him. The presence of the gaunt figure, its eerie smile stretching impossibly wide, pulled Mark into a state of frozen dread. His heart beat faster, a frantic rhythm that seemed out of sync with the eerie stillness of the room. He had faced threats before, but none had ever felt so personal, so relentlessly invasive. The figure stood before him, its shadow distorting the space around them, making the room appear larger than it was. The air grew colder, as if the very atmosphere around him had shifted in response to the figure's arrival. Mark's mind raced, scrambling for a way out, a way to escape. The voices, the shadows, the storm. They had all been parts of something more insidious than he could have imagined. His breath became shallow, and the weight in the air pressed against his chest, making it difficult to think clearly. But one thing became painfully obvious. There was no running from this. The storm, the shifting reality, it had followed him, and it was now manifesting in a form that was unmistakably real. The figure did not move, but Mark could feel its gaze burning into him. Its hollow eyes seemed to peer into the deepest recesses of his mind, unraveling his thoughts, exposing his worst fears. The room began to pulse, as if it were alive, breathing in sync with the figure's presence. The walls seemed to close in, their once solid surfaces now rippling like water disturbed by unseen forces. Mark could no longer tell what was real and what was merely a figment of his own terror. And then the figure spoke, its voice not a sound but a sensation that coursed through Mark's very being. It was a whisper that rattled his bones, a voice that didn't belong to any human. "You've been looking for answers," it said, the words curling around him like smoke, suffocating him with their weight. But the truth was never something you could find. It was always here, inside you, just as it has always been inside everyone. Mark's body tensed at the words. The truth? What truth was it referring to? Was it the same truth the storm had tried to bury deep within him? He didn't have time to process the meaning of the figure's words because, in an instant, the room shifted again. The walls seemed to collapse inward, pulling Mark towards the center of the space. His stomach churned as the air became thick, like quicksand, each step he took growing heavier. The figure was still there, watching, waiting, but something was different. The shadows on the walls began to move in patterns that felt strangely familiar. They weren't just random shapes. They seemed to form symbols, intricate and precise, as if they were speaking a language Mark could almost understand. It was a language of movement, of hidden meaning, woven into the fabric of the storm itself. A sudden flash of light filled the room, blinding Mark for a split second. When his vision cleared, the figure had vanished, replaced by something that made his stomach drop in horror. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror. The glass was dark, almost black, reflecting nothing but the oppressive shadows that seemed to swirl around it. And yet, as Mark's gaze fixed on it, he saw something. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement, but it grew clearer with each passing moment. He wasn't just looking at the room, he was looking at himself. In the reflection, Mark saw a version of himself, one that was not quite right. His face was twisted, contorted into an expression of fear, but it was a fear that didn't seem to belong to him. His eyes were wide, but there was something cold in them, something distant. The reflection moved too, but not in sync with Mark. It was as if the reflection had a life of its own, separate from his actions. It smiled, a grin that mirrored the gaunt figures, and Mark felt a wave of nausea rise in his throat. "What are you?" Mark muttered, the words barely escaping his lips. His voice sounded strange, almost as if it were coming from somewhere far away. His reflection did not answer. Instead, it began to reach out, its hands pressing against the mirror's surface as though trying to break free. Mark took a step back, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. He wanted to turn away, to escape, but his feet remained rooted to the spot. The mirror, like the figure, seemed to have trapped him in its grasp. As the reflection continued to move independently of him, Mark could feel his body responding, his own movements becoming jerky, disjointed. It was as if the mirror was controlling him, pulling at the strings of his will, turning him into a puppet of its design. A wave of terror washed over him, but there was no escape. He had seen the truth in the reflection, and it was something he could no longer deny. The storm was not an external force. It was a part of him, an inherent darkness that had always existed, buried deep inside. The mirror cracked, not in the way one would expect, but as if the glass itself had been torn open by something unseen, a rift that spread across its surface like the veins of an ancient tree. Mark's heart raced as the cracks widened, and the reflection's grin grew wider, impossibly so, until it seemed to consume the entire space of the glass. Then, with a violent shudder, the mirror shattered, and Mark stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. He had no idea what was happening anymore, no idea if the storm was real or if it was a manifestation of something darker, something within him. As the shards of the mirror scattered across the floor, the shadows around him seemed to grow deeper, the walls closing in once again. Mark could feel it, the storm returning in full force, wrapping itself around him like a suffocating cocoon. There was no longer any question of escaping. Mark realized with grim clarity that the storm, the force that had been haunting them all, was not just a physical entity. It was a reflection of their own deepest fears, a manifestation of their darkest secrets. And the storm, like the mirror, could never truly be shattered. It would always return. It would always be a part of him. The storm, relentless and ever-encroaching, had now become something far more insidious. Mark had no real sense of where he was, or even who he was anymore. The events that had unfolded over the past few days felt like fragments of a dream, or perhaps, more accurately, fragments of a nightmare. The storm had not passed. It had only shifted, weaving its way deeper into the fabric of his reality. In the moments after the mirror shattered, Mark had thought he had gained a moment of clarity, an understanding of what was happening. But now, in the silence that followed, that clarity seemed as elusive as ever. As he stumbled through the now darkened cabin, the walls pressing in around him like the weight of an invisible force, he realized that the boundaries between the physical world and the twisted visions he had witnessed were no longer so easily defined. The storm was inside him, yes, but it was also everywhere, lurking just beyond the veil of the ordinary. Every step he took felt like an intrusion into a world that had already been altered, reshaped by forces far beyond his control. His hands trembled as he touched the walls, feeling for something solid, something familiar, but it only slipped further from his grasp with each passing moment. Mark was not alone. He could feel it, the weight of unseen eyes upon him, the flickering shadows, the odd sounds that came from somewhere deep within the cabin, had all become part of the cacophony of his existence. The cabin, once a retreat for families seeking peace, had transformed into a prison. Each door, each window, seemed to close in on him, trapping him in a cycle of fear and uncertainty. But what was more unsettling than the external forces surrounding him was the growing sense that something had changed within him. The storm inside, the storm that had claimed his thoughts and dreams, was no longer something he could push away. It had fused with his very being, and he could feel it, an emptiness growing inside him, a hollow ache that could not be filled. It was as if his soul had begun to unravel, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a fragment of the man he used to be. His thoughts were fractured, broken into shards that scattered across his mind, and each new thought seemed to pull him deeper into the storm. He had seen the truth, or at least he thought he had, but now he wasn't so sure. The figure in the mirror, the reflection that had taunted him with its twisted grin, was that really him? Or was it something else? Something that had always existed beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise? He could feel its presence, lurking just beneath the skin, a part of him that he had never acknowledged, let alone understood. The storm had revealed it, brought it to the forefront, and now it was all he could think about. What had once been hidden had now broken free, and Mark was left grappling with a truth that was far more uncomfortable than he could have imagined. As he stumbled through the cabin, the walls around him pulsing in strange rhythms, he felt a shift in the air. A new presence had entered the room, one he could not see but could sense, like a pressure building in his chest. It was not the same figure from before, nor the mirror's distorted reflection. This was different, subtle, almost insidious in its familiarity. His breath caught in his throat, and his skin prickled with a sense of unease. The storm had never been about just external forces. It had always been about him. The house had become a conduit for his own inner demons, and now those demons have found their way out, creeping into every corner of the space around him. The flickering lights above him buzzed, and the room seemed to stretch in impossible ways, expanding and contracting in time with his racing heartbeat. Mark could no longer tell what was real. His mind was betraying him, twisting the familiar into something unrecognizable. He reached out, his hand brushing against the wall once again, but this time it felt different. The texture was wrong. The wood had turned soft and malleable, as if it were made of something organic. A sharp, acrid scent filled the air, like something rotting in the dampness. He recoiled, his pulse quickening as the walls seemed to shift, transforming into something grotesque, as though the cabin itself had turned on him. The storm outside had not quieted. In fact, it felt as though it had intensified, its fury now matching the tumult within him. The winds howled louder, the rain pounded harder against the windows, but Mark couldn't focus on that. His mind was consumed by the sensation of the cabin moving around him. The floor beneath him seemed to shift, tilting at odd angles, as though the house was alive, breathing in time with his own panic. The shadows on the walls began to stretch and warp, twisting into shapes that seemed vaguely human. He couldn't make them out fully, but he could feel their presence, like they were waiting for him to make the next move. Then, as quickly as it had started, the sensation stopped. The room became still, eerily so. The walls stopped moving, the shadows fell back into place, and the air felt thick with silence. Mark stood motionless in the center of the room, unsure of what had just happened. Had it been real? Or had it been another manifestation of the storm? He didn't know anymore. His mind was fraying at the edges, unraveling faster than he could hold on to it. The storm was not just a force outside. It was a part of him, and it was becoming impossible to tell where it ended and he began. Mark looked around the room, searching for any sign of escape. But as his gaze fell on the windows, his stomach sank. The storm had brought something new, a wall of darkness beyond the glass, a void that seemed to stretch into infinity. There was no sky, no trees, no world beyond. The world had disappeared, leaving only this fractured space, this broken reality where nothing made sense. He was trapped. The storm was not just something he had to survive, it was something he had to confront. But how could he fight something that had already taken root inside him? In that moment, Mark realized something horrifying. He wasn't just stuck in a cabin. He was stuck in his own mind, imprisoned by his own fears. The storm wasn't outside. It was within, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how many doors he opened, he would never escape it. He could only face it or be consumed by it. The passage of time had lost all meaning for Mark. What felt like days had likely been only hours, or perhaps mere minutes. The boundaries of time were distorted in the cabin, like everything else within its walls. The clock on the wall had long since stopped, its hands frozen at 2:37. It was as though the house itself had slipped into some timeless void, detached from the world outside. But Mark, now gripped by the storm's pull, had no interest in the passage of time. His focus had shifted inward to the dark recesses of his own memories. There was a moment when Mark had considered leaving. When the door had opened and he had glimpsed the storm outside, it felt like an invitation to escape. But he knew better now. No matter where he went, the storm would follow. The cabin, with its warped walls and strange rhythms, was an extension of something far deeper, something that had always been with him, hidden beneath the surface. The mirror had revealed a sliver of this hidden world, but now Mark understood. It was not a separate entity. It was him. It always had been. But even with this understanding, Mark could not shake the feeling that something else was at work here, something outside of himself. He had tried to convince himself that the hallucinations, the shifting walls, the disembodied whispers, were all products of his own unraveling mind. But there were moments, brief and fleeting, when he could almost sense something beyond his own psyche. It was as if there were echoes, strange reverberations from the past, bending the very fabric of reality. These echoes called to him, their voices almost familiar, like a song he had once known but had forgotten. They begged for his attention, whispering in the dark corners of his mind, urging him to listen. In one such moment, as he stood in the center of the room, eyes scanning the shadows, Mark heard it, an unmistakable sound, faint but clear, a child's laugh. It was high-pitched, innocent, but laced with an undertone of something sinister. His heart skipped a beat. He spun around, half expecting to see a child standing in the doorway, but the room was empty. The laugh echoed through his ears again, this time louder, as if it were coming from within the walls themselves. Mark staggered back, his breath quickening. He knew that laugh. He had heard it before, many years ago. It belonged to his younger sister, Claire. Claire had been the light of his childhood. Her laughter had always been infectious, a reminder of simpler days when the world had not yet revealed its darker edges. But that memory was tainted now, tainted by the tragedy that had followed. Claire had disappeared when they were both teenagers. One night, she had simply gone missing, vanishing into the darkness without a trace. Despite exhaustive searches and years of heartache, no one had ever found her. She was gone, lost to some unknown fate, and Mark had carried the guilt ever since. He had blamed himself. If only he had paid more attention, if only he hadn't been so absorbed in his own life, maybe she would still be here. But now, in the oppressive silence of the cabin, Mark was forced to confront the truth. Claire's disappearance had never been an isolated event. The storm, the darkness, the strange disturbances, they were all connected. His sister's disappearance, the lingering unease that had haunted his family for years, had not been a random tragedy. It had been part of something larger, something that had been brewing long before Claire ever stepped foot in this cabin. The echoes of the past were not merely memories. They were warnings. Warnings about forces that were not bound by time or space, but by something far more insidious. As Mark pieced the fragments of his memory together, he realized that he had been ignoring the most important truth. The storm was not just inside him. It was inside his family. It had always been a part of them, a malignant force that had seeped into their lives, shaping their destinies without them even realizing it. His father had been the first to notice it, the strange occurrences, the oddities that seemed to follow them wherever they went. But Mark had dismissed his father's warnings as the ramblings of an aging man, unable to accept that the family had been marked by something beyond their comprehension. The storm, it seemed, had been tied to the cabin long before he had ever arrived. It had been a catalyst, an awakening. The land, the very earth beneath the cabin, had been scarred by something ancient, something that had twisted its way into the family's bloodline. Mark had always felt a strange connection to the cabin, as though it called to him, as if something deep within its walls recognized him. But he had never understood why. Now he realized that it wasn't just the cabin. It was the storm. It was everything. His family had been drawn here year after year because they were part of a cycle that had never been broken. Mark sank to his knees, his mind racing. Claire's disappearance had never been an accident. She had been taken by the storm. But why? Why her? And why now? After all these years, Was the storm returning? As the laughter echoed in his mind again, he could almost hear Claire's voice calling out to him, urging him to follow, to understand. She had known something that Mark had never been able to see, and now it was too late. He was tangled in the storm's web, trapped by the same forces that had claimed her. The room around him began to shift again, the walls breathing, the shadows twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The storm outside intensified, a thunderous roar that seemed to shake the very foundation of the cabin. And in that moment, Mark understood. He was not just trapped in the cabin, he was trapped in the storm, and it was coming for him, just as it had come for Claire, just as it had come for his family. There was no escaping it now. The past had caught up with him, and there was no place left to run. Mark could no longer deny the truth. The storm outside, the whispers within the walls, and the echoes of his past all pointed to a singular conclusion. The cabin was not just a place. It was a nexus, a point where something far darker than mere memory resided. The storm had always been there, waiting for him to uncover its secrets. And now that he had, there was no turning back. It wasn't just the land that was cursed. It was the very fabric of his family, twisted by forces older than time itself. As the thunder cracked overhead, Mark could feel the weight of the storm pressing in on him, as if the air had grown thick with the presence of something unseen. He had no idea how much time had passed since he last saw the mirror, but he was certain of one thing. Something had changed within him. He could sense it in the way the walls groaned and shifted, in the way the air seemed charged with an unnatural energy. The storm had not only drawn him here, it had claimed him, body and soul. His mind raced, cycling through the fragmented memories of his family's visits to the cabin. The laughter of children, the jovial conversations around the dinner table, the endless days spent fishing on the lake. It all seemed like a lifetime ago. In the years following Claire's disappearance, everything had changed. The once welcoming cabin had become a place of dread, where the very air seemed to grow heavier with each passing year. But despite the ominous feeling that had pervaded every visit since Claire vanished, Mark had never questioned the draw of the place. He had never wondered why, despite all the horror, they kept returning. Now, in the face of the storm, he understood. His family had been bound to the cabin by more than mere tradition. They had been bound by blood, by some ancestral promise that no one had ever spoken of aloud. This wasn't just a place for vacations. It was a prison. The storm was not a random occurrence. It was a cyclical force, a cycle that repeated itself every generation. And Mark's family had been part of it for as long as anyone could remember. His father, in his desperation, had tried to break the cycle, but he had failed, just as Mark was destined to fail now. Mark could feel the presence of something in the room with him, something old, something ancient, pressing against the edges of his awareness. He wanted to scream, to flee, but the weight of the storm seemed to keep him rooted in place. And then, through the oppressive silence, came a voice, a soft whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. It was Claire. She was calling him, urging him to come closer, to enter the heart of the storm. At first, Mark hesitated. He was terrified of what awaited him, terrified of what he might find. But the voice grew louder, more insistent. The call was not just for him. It was for everyone. His entire family was tied to this place, tied to this curse, and they all had a role to play in the storm's unending cycle. Claire had known it, and now it was Mark's turn to understand. He was the key, the last piece of the puzzle. With a sense of inevitability, Mark made his way toward the center of the cabin, where the storm seemed to coalesce, where the air was thick with static. His mind swam with confusion and fear, but beneath it all, there was a strange calm. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment when everything would be revealed. The room around him seemed to warp and stretch, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. Shadows shifted, coalesced into shapes that flickered like old photographs. Faces, his family, Claire, they were all there, their eyes pleading for him to understand. And then the storm answered. It began as a low rumble, a vibration in the air, but it quickly grew in intensity. The walls of the cabin shook as if they were alive, bending and twisting as the storm outside merged with the forces within. Mark's head spun, and he felt himself being drawn into the heart of the storm, a whirlpool of energy and fear that threatened to consume him. The echoes of his family's voices, his mother, his father, Claire, faded into the background as the storm itself took center stage. He had no choice but to give in. The storm was not an external force. It was part of him. He was part of it. The air grew colder, the wind howling louder, and the walls seemed to close in. In the eye of the storm, Mark found himself standing in the center of the room, his breath shallow, his hands trembling. The room had changed. No longer was it the cabin he had known. Now, it was something far older, a place that seemed to exist outside of time. And there, in the center of the room, was the mirror again, but it was different now. It wasn't just reflecting his image, it was showing him something more. Behind the glass, he saw his family, standing together in the storm, their faces pale and terrified. They were not merely reflections. They were trapped, just as he was. They had always been trapped. The truth hit him like a wave. The storm wasn't a curse. It was a binding force, a tether that had kept his family in its grasp for generations. They were all part of it, part of the storm's endless cycle. And now, it was his turn to take his place. Claire's disappearance, his father's frantic warnings, his own guilt, all of it had led him here. The storm had come for him, just as it had come for his family, and there was no escaping it. Mark's fate had been sealed long ago. As the storm raged around him, Mark stepped forward, his hands reaching for the mirror. He wasn't afraid anymore. He understood now. He was part of the storm, and he would never leave. The storm had not ceased. It had grown, not just in intensity, but in presence, as if the very air around the cabin had taken on a life of its own. Mark stood in the center of the room, the mirror before him a portal to another world, one that had always been just beyond his reach. The storm's energy swirled, a vortex that seemed to stretch time and space, bending everything into its chaotic rhythm. As the final piece of the puzzle slotted into place, Mark understood what the storm truly was. Not an external force, but the embodiment of his family's curse. A curse not just on the land, but on his bloodline. The storm was both the beginning and the end. There was no escape from it now. The moment he had touched the mirror, everything had unraveled. The veil that had separated the world of the living from whatever lay beyond had been ripped wide open, and Mark had crossed the threshold. He was no longer just a man, a son, or a brother. He was part of something far greater, something older than the cabin itself. The storm was a manifestation of the family's sins, a consequence of years spent in denial, of generations trying to outrun the inevitable. It was not just the land that was cursed. It was them, bound forever to the tempest they had unknowingly called forth. He turned away from the mirror, and the room around him began to warp again, twisting in ways that defied logic. The walls stretched, and the shadows that once seemed benign now moved with purpose, growing long and distorted, as though reaching for something. Mark's mind screamed for release, but his body was frozen. His family's voices were distant now, fading in and out like static on a broken radio. He could hear Claire, his mother, his father, but their voices were no longer pleading with him. They had become part of the storm, lost to its chaotic embrace. The thunder outside cracked louder, rattling the windows, shaking the very foundation of the cabin. Mark tried to move, to find some escape, but the ground beneath him seemed to give way, as if the cabin itself were sinking into the earth. The storm had taken on a life of its own, and it no longer needed him. It had absorbed everything, his memories, his family, his very soul, and now it was complete. As Mark stumbled backward, his legs no longer felt solid. The floor seemed to melt beneath him, and he felt as though he were falling, though the space around him remained still. The storm's energy pulsed through him, as if it had become a part of his very bloodstream. He could feel it in his veins, in his chest, in his mind. The voices were no longer distant. They were inside him. They were him. The cabin was no longer a place. It was a symbol, a crossroads, where the living and the dead had met, and where the cycle would begin again. There was no salvation here. The realization hit him with an unsettling clarity. Mark had always thought he could break the cycle, that he could escape the storm, but he had misunderstood. There was no escaping the storm. It was the storm that had shaped him, that had shaped his family, and it was the storm that would now shape everything. His father, Claire, his ancestors, they had all been swept up in it, and now Mark too would be lost to it. The storm was not an event. It was an entity, a presence that existed beyond the confines of time. It had always been, and it would always be. He could feel the storm closing in around him, pressing against his chest, squeezing out every breath. His body began to tremble, not from fear but from something far deeper. His mind was unraveling, and with it his understanding of what was real. The storm blurred the lines between past, present, and future, merging them into one chaotic whole. He saw flashes of his family, his parents, his wife, Claire, all caught in the storm's fury. Their faces twisted in agony, yet they no longer seemed to be suffering. They had been absorbed into the storm long ago, and now they were merely echoes of the past, whispers that would never be heard again. Mark's thoughts became more erratic, his sense of time slipping away as the storm's grip tightened. But there was something else, something beneath the layers of fear and confusion, a sense of finality. The storm had come to claim him, and now it had succeeded. He was part of it. He had always been part of it. And as the storm's winds howled louder, as the thunder cracked and the lightning flashed in brilliant arcs of white light, Mark realized that the cycle had not ended. It had only begun again. The storm was eternal, unbroken, and it would never leave. It had fed on his family's fear, their regrets, their guilt. It had twisted their lives into something unrecognizable, and now it had consumed him. He was the final piece of the puzzle, the last link in a chain that stretched back for generations. And just as the storm had claimed his ancestors, it would claim those who came after him. The curse would not die. It would never die. The storm's grip tightened one last time, and Mark's vision began to fade, replaced by an all-encompassing darkness. There was no escape now. The cycle would continue, the storm would rage on, and he would be its eternal prisoner. The land, the cabin, his family, they were all part of the storm, and the storm was all that would remain. And so, as the storm raged on, Mark was lost to the darkness, a part of the tempest, a prisoner of the cycle that would never break. The cabin stood silent in the woods, its secrets buried deep within, waiting for the next family to come, to become a part of the storm, to fuel its eternal, unyielding rage.